Welcome back. And moving on to our second segment for today. As we mentioned in the very beginning, we are going to bring you more about the history of the civilization of Africa, and for sure Egypt of Africa as well. So talking about this, and maybe we were just talking right now with our guest that sometimes people, they do not consider Egypt as part of Africa, but definitely Egypt is part of Africa, and we are talking about the civilization of this continent in general. So today we have the pleasure to have with us Mr. Samir Abbass. He's an Egyptologist. First of all, good morning, sir.
Good morning. Glad to be with you.
So, sir, why are we talking about Africa's history today?
Yes. There was a very interesting comments made by a leader of a very significant country, more specified the USA, about Africa when he was discussing the immigrations rules in the White House. And unfortunately, his comments is showing that a great ignorance about African rule in ancient history and in the history of the world in general today. And that's why I choose to talk about Africa today as an educational material to help not only President Trump, but also many of the Egyptians and many of the people around, which is about the role of Africa in ancient.
I think you can talk about it in figures, facts and figures as well,
definitely,
statistics.
Yes. Definitely. So in numbers, talking about Africa, Africa is the second largest continent, and with population concerns the second largest population in the whole world, like in continent-wise. The most interesting fact about the population of Africa is more than 50% of the African population, they are below 25 years old, which is a very productive age. In the time that when almost 80% of the European population is over 25 years old. So another interesting fact about Africa as well, that there's four climate zones in Africa, and vary from a very arid desert and into a rainforest. There is lots of fertile lands in Africa. There is a big population, estimated as 1.2 billion human being. Young people with lots of resources can turn Africa into a great paradise. So, and another interesting fact about Africa is that 54 countries, all of them except only 2, has been colonized by European power from the 19th century, in the early 19th century, and in the 20th century. And this give you an example of how rich Africa is, because if Africa is not that rich, that will not bring the interest of Europeans when they were powerful in the 19th and 20th century to take over, to have advantage over Africa in that time. And that might explain why Africa or African countries are very laid back now. They left behind borders, rules, political problems, culture problems affected badly in Africa, and that helps to understand the difficult situation of Africa today.
So, sir, Africa is the home for the first human being. Can you elaborate on this?
So, that's another important fact about Africa, that the beginning of human race started in Africa. More specified in East Africa, in Ethiopia. Where the most important, the most common theory about the human race began is in East Africa. One of the oldest relics from a human being, looks like the human being looks like today, is 200,000 years old, found in East Africa. By the way, in 2017 there was a new discovery, there is debate about it, is a human part of a human body dates back to 300,000 years old, found in Morocco. And I'm glad that you mentioned Egypt as an African civilization. Egypt is the oldest African civilization, and in history timeline that will come Kush, the civilization of Kush, which is based in Sudan, represented in the Fufa, Nabata period, and Marawi, and flourished from the 8th century BC up until the 4th century AD. And following that was the kingdom of Axiom, based in Ethiopia. flourished from the year 100 AD and exists until 900 AD. And not forgetting West Africa, which is the Kingdom of Ghana, the Kingdom of Mali.
Yes.
Not forgetting Great Zimbabwe.
Yes, actually we have some pictures here
and
to
the Swahili
you can elaborate on
Africa
that
as well. So that's the picture showing one of the very old relics of human race, which is found in Africa, and showing the location where it was found as well. That was found in Ethiopia, which is not far from the capital of Ethiopia, Addis Ababa. So there was one of when we were making brainstorming before talking today. You talked about Egypt and the Egyptians. And you need to understand why Egypt civilizations has been stripped out from its African roots. There was a very important political reason behind that, and not forgetting that the history of ancient Egypt and the decipher of the ancient Egyptian language has been started by European scholars, not Egyptians, unfortunately. So most of the history of the world that is studied today is written from Western perspective, and no wonder that you hear a lot about the Roman, Greek civilizations, but you hear less about the Kushite civilization and the other civilizations of Africa, which I have just listed right now. So there was in the one of the main reasons of the colony or the Western countries to made it to Africa in the 19th and 20th century is not only the resources exist in Africa, but also the slaves. And the slave trade that was a very profitable trade in that time. They promoted to their slave trades as following. They suggested that, or they came with a theory that the African as a race is not well developed like the rest of the human race. And that's given excuse to the other people to treat the African slaves as they treat their farm animals. And in the same time when the ancient Egyptian civilization discovered with its pyramids in Egypt and greatness, which dates back to 7,000 or 5,000 years ago, if that it was introduced as an African civilization, that will blow up their business. Now there is a picture of King Tut and his wife, Ankhis and Ba'atun, and which is showing that the African features they have. So when you look at the ancient Egyptian art, the ancient Egyptians, they were mainly African people. The origin of human being in Africa and the Nile Valley is...
So you think that Egyptians used to have African features?
Actually, ancient Egyptians, they are Africans. So there was lots of blood influence, which happens later on, after the collapse of the ancient Egyptian civilization from the Mediterranean Sea and from the Middle East, and that makes the big variety of the features of the Egyptians today. But the ancient Egyptian, when you look at their art, you know, there is like the piece of art, right? It is dark skin, slim body, brown reddish in color. Not only, even the culture practice of the ancient Egyptians back in that time, it is very much rooted with Africans, and there is many of the practices which the ancient Egyptian practice back in that time is still in practice in African tribes today. So back to the point that it was because of the slave trade. If the ancient Egyptian civilization introduced in the right content as an African civilization, that will destroy their business, because that means that 5,000 years ago there was much more civilized people in Africa than the Europeans, and definitely that's completely will destroy their slave business. So
I've also a picture for, I think, an Egyptian queen.
That was Queen T.
Yes.
And you can see the African features.
Yes, she has an African
which is very clear on it. And not only when you go further, actually south in Sudan, so there is a Defufa, and I think that I brought some illustrations. Maybe they are of a famous historical attractions based in Sudan from the Kushite civilization, like the one in Defufa of the mud bricks. It is the oldest civilization in sub-Sahara desert. Following that is a temple in an area known as Naga in Sudan, in the heart of Sudan. And following that is a beautiful picture, which is number 9, of the pyramids of Meroe. So these 3 pictures showing a very important attractions in Sudan from the Kushite civilization, and showing that how much they were advanced. There is a very striking thing about the pyramids when it comes into Sudan. There is one pyramid field in Sudan, which is Meroe, has almost the same number of pyramids exist in Egypt. So again, that is not, you don't learn much about that, because the history as it is taught today is not wrote from our perspective. It is wrote from the colony perspective. So in Sudan alone, there is 340 pyramids. And if we move to another picture, which is number 10,
Yes.
so that will be the picture which is shortly after the Merowe pyramids, you'll find that there is a group of statues of leaders, kings, pharaohs.
This one? Yes.
Yes, this is the one which is in display now. When you see that, you know what you can see. Egyptian pharaohs.
Yes.
It's actually no, they are African. They are Sudanese pharaohs. They are dynasty 25, and they managed to rule. They established a very strong kingdom in Sudan, and they controlled in that time, in that particular time, they controlled Egypt and Sudan as well, and they adapted the ancient Egyptian culture. They wrote down their history in hieroglyphics like the ancient Egyptian people, and worldwide known as the Black Pharaohs. And they were a very significant historical period in Africa as well. The story of Africa, we need to talk about, actually, there is another important subject about why Africa is very important today, not just to Egypt, to the whole world. So Africa has a manpower, has resources, has water, has fertile lands, can easily feed the entire population of the mankind, and simply we need Africa than Africa needs us. So today episode is help Egyptians together with other people to understand their connection, their solid connection with Africa.
Thank you, Mr. Samir. And now, dear viewers, we come to the end of today's edition of the Breakfast Show, and see you tomorrow with a new group.